All right, good morning, everyone. We are going to get started in about 30 seconds here. We appreciate you joining us this morning. All right, well, welcome. We are excited to see you on this sunshiny Friday morning as we talk about check-in, check-out, and how to support students virtually while implementing this intervention. So for those of you who are new to us, we are the Diverse Learners Cooperative. We are a nonprofit that seeks to connect teachers and leaders with professional learning, resources, and networks so that they can improve outcomes for the diverse learners they serve, as well as increase their own capacity as teachers and leaders within their school buildings. My name is Mary, and I will be walking us through the coffee chat this morning. So if you have any questions, please feel free to throw them in the chat. Otherwise, we can take some time at the end as well to go through any questions that you might have. So what we're going to talk about today is exploring check-in, check-out as an intervention. How can we utilize this during virtual learning in order to build relationships with students and help them meet their behavioral goals? So we'll look at our current context for what check-in, check-out might look like now, as well as some ways that we can adapt it to meet students' needs if they are remaining virtual this school year. And finally, we can talk about how this might help us transition back to in-person learning if our schools are planning to do that later this year. So, as we know in our current context, it's been almost a full year since virtual learning began for many of us. And a lot of students and teachers haven't gone back in person at all this school year. So they haven't met their teachers face to face, they haven't met their peers face to face. And that has caused a lot of changes for students as they are working to learn in their home environment. We know that a change in a learning environment, or any environment for that matter, can lead to changes in behavior. We know that home had previously not been associated with having to do schoolwork, and that's been a huge hurdle for a lot of our students to try to overcome as they manage the learning requirements of school while remaining at home. We also know that students' behavior does coincide with their social, emotional, and communication needs. A lot of our students are struggling with feelings of grief or anxiety. They're stressed about the current situation, and they are also really frustrated about all of the different things that they're having to juggle without the social interaction or the community that in-person school normally provides. We also know, again, that they've lost a lot of these opportunities, especially those to build relationships, and that can be a big challenge for some of our students. So when we think about check-in, check-out, some of us might not be familiar with what that intervention entails. So when we talk about check-in, check-out, it is an evidence-based or research-based targeted intervention that is really beneficial for supporting students who are demonstrating frequent but low severity behavior. So it's a really structured monitoring process that walks students through specific behavioral goals and helps them learn how to exhibit these behaviors throughout the day while receiving feedback from their teachers as well as from their mentor in the intervention. It also increases communication between the home and school environment, which can be really powerful now, especially as our students are still remaining in the home setting while accessing virtual learning. It has a couple of different names. Check-in, check-out is the most common name, but you might also, as you do more research on it, find it as a behavior report card, a daily progress report, or even the behavior education program. So these are just a couple of the different terms used to describe it. Who is it for? So when we think about this is an intervention that is not quite individualized, but it is for those students who are not responding to the school-wide expectations at Tier 1. So we typically think of this as a Tier 2 type intervention. And we typically use school-wide goals or expectations as the target behavioral goals that students are trying to meet. This is most effective with students whose behavior is really reinforced by adult attention. So those students who will engage in challenging behaviors in order to access that adult attention can really benefit from having these structured attention points throughout the day. It's also been shown in the research to be effective at every grade level. So whether you're elementary, middle, or high school, this intervention can be used across both general and special education settings, and it can be used for a variety of different behavioral skills that you might be trying to tackle. So what does it actually look like in practice? When we think about check-in, check-out, how can this be used virtually? When we think about the process that would typically occur in person, we think of it as a 4-step process. So step 1 is that a student is assigned a mentor. This mentor remains consistent throughout the intervention as much as possible. And the student and the mentor have a daily check-in in the morning in which they go over the student's behavioral goals for that day. Depending on the student, this might be a daily check-in, or it might even be just a couple of times a week or even once a week. Again, that depends on what the student needs. Then the student moves throughout their day across different classes with teachers, and teachers across the day provide feedback on that student's behavior in comparison to the goals that they're trying to meet. They give feedback, they give encouragement when the student does well, and they give instruction as to how the student could demonstrate the behavioral goals in the classroom. Finally, at the end of the day, the student meets again with their mentor to check out, in which they calculate how many points the student earned towards these behavioral goals throughout the day. And they take that and they use that to influence or to see if the student has met their behavioral goal either for the day or for the week in order to access a desired reinforcer. And then finally, that daily progress should be shared with families, whether in person, we would typically send that sheet home to have parents sign. It might also look like a text message, that sort of thing. But the family communication here is crucial so that everybody remains in the loop. Now, when we think about virtually, again, our students are at home and we're at our homes, we're not seeing them in person. So these checkouts are going to have to look a little bit different. One way that we can adapt for virtual learning is to conduct check-ins using texts, phone calls, video chats, or even Google Forms. Again, this is going to be really dependent on what is helpful and effective for the individual student. So you might have multiple students receiving check-in, check-out, but they are checking in different ways. So the same thing goes for checkouts. You might have a student that really needs that video support in the morning, but maybe they only need a text in the afternoon to let them know how they did towards meeting their goal. We also want to make sure that the behavioral goals that we are working on have been adapted for virtual learning. Many times when we were in person, what a lot of schools would do is they would use their 3 to 5 school-wide goals as the behavioral goals. Again, we want to make sure that if whatever goals we are using reflect virtual learning expectations. So what does it mean to be safe during virtual learning? What does it mean to be responsible or respectful? We want to make sure that those are outlined really clearly for students so they know exactly what to do. We also want to make sure that we revisit the point goals based on who is involved in the rating. If we know that students might only get a couple of ratings throughout the day as opposed to from every single class, we want to make sure that our point goal is adjusted to reflect that so that students aren't always missing their goal just because teachers or other adults that are participating haven't filled out the forms. So we want to make sure that we are flexible there so that students are set up for success. And then finally, the most important part, we always have to include a reinforcer. This should be something that the student is interested and motivated to work for. It can be something that's given daily or at the end of the week, depending on the student's needs. But we know something is a reinforcer if it increases the behavior that we want to see. So making sure we conduct some sort of survey or have a conversation with the student at the beginning to see what they want to work for. I'd also advise here to make sure that we change these often to keep it exciting, right? Something that was a reinforcer 3 weeks ago may or may not still be a reinforcer now. So if you start to see a change in the point goal data, that would be an indicator that you might either need to switch up some part of the intervention or switch up the reinforcer. When it comes to step 2, when students normally throughout the day would meet with teachers and get feedback on their behavioral goals, there are some ways we can adapt this for virtual as well. So we can prioritize the activity in which behavior will be observed. Depending on what your goals are, this might mean that the student's behavior is only tracked or assigned points during live synchronous sessions and not during asynchronous work. Or vice versa. If you have a student who's really struggling with independent work completion, you might only track it during asynchronous time. You also want to make sure that you're providing these opportunities and that teachers are aware that the student does need feedback on their behavioral goals so that we can provide that feedback and that encouragement during class as well. This might look like leveraging some staff who are available in the building. So for example, if you have a paraprofessional or a coach or somebody else who's able to come into a live synchronous class and take some time to observe the student's behavior, that could be really helpful to the teacher who is teaching the lesson so that they are not having to manage multiple things during virtual learning at once. Again, it will be important that we do have that teacher and student communicating regularly about the student's behavior, but there may be a way to leverage staff here in order to make sure that the student is receiving enough attention and enough feedback. Another way to track data would be to encourage teachers or case managers to use Google Forms that they could fill out right at the end of class to indicate whether or not the student met their goal. And then finally, this serves as an opportunity, especially for students who we want to increase their own independence, to teach them how to self-monitor their behavior during asynchronous time. This might look like showing students how to use a timer to remind themselves to check their behavior, or it might look like a process of having the student rate themselves and then comparing that to an adult rating based on the work that they complete. So there's a lot of opportunity for skill growth here. And then finally, when we think about the last step in terms of communicating with family, we want to make sure that we're viewing families as collaborators. Because students are at home, if family members are available, whether it's an older sibling, a cousin, a grandparent, a parent, we can see if we can leverage them as raters as well. So for example, when I just mentioned this self-monitoring, we might not be able to see the student while they're completing asynchronous work, but there might be another adult in the house who can. And so could we provide coaching or some sort of training for them to be able to help the student self-monitor their behavior and compare behavior points or that sort of thing across asynchronous time. We also know that families might need to help us with providing reinforcers. There's only so much that we can provide through a screen. And so it may be that we collaborate with families in order to have students earn something at home, whether it's picking what's going to be for dinner or picking the movie that they might watch over the weekend. There are different ways to incorporate family-based reinforcers into this intervention as well. And then finally, we want to make sure that we're communicating progress consistently. This should look like using whatever method is most flexible for the parents right now. Some parents might only be able to text based on their work schedule. Others might prefer a video chat with their child so that everybody is on the same page. So again, being flexible here and making this part of the intervention individualized will help to really help you see success. So here are some examples here. You will receive the slide deck in the same email that you used to register for the coffee chat. And all of these are clickable links that you can explore further. So on the left here is a 10-page guide for how to adapt check-in, check-out for virtual learning that has even more ideas than what we've shared. There's also a sample check-in, check-out card that is shown here that could be modified in order to be used with students. So you'll see here, they have listed the school-wide expectations on the left, and then they have the different types of instructional activities on the top. Again, we can be flexible here depending on what skills we're trying to build with the student in terms of deciding which types of learning we're going to observe. This is also an example of a morning check-in form. I've linked a whole page that has them for morning, midday, afternoon, weekly. So you can go in and check those out and make a copy on your own drive in order to edit and use those with students. And then finally, this is my favorite list of virtual PBIS rewards. So if you are getting stuck on different ideas that you could offer to student, this has about 75 different ideas that you might be able to use with your students. So why should we do this? Why should we go through all of these procedures in order to benefit students right now? One of the biggest reasons to use check-in, check-out right now is to build relationships. One of the key things that is missing or that has been harder to do during virtual learning is build those relationships with students. We know that in the building, those relationships often happen bit by bit. That quick conversation in the hallway, talking to the student in the cafeteria, seeing them at the end of the day as they were getting on the bus. Those little moments don't exist as well in virtual learning. And so we can leverage this intervention as a way to build those relationships. And we know that building relationships and really having strong connections between students and staff members has a wide range of effects, including higher grades, higher attendance, fewer suspensions or fewer time out of class, and even lower school dropout rates. There's a great video here of a local Nashville school, Fall Hamilton, that talks about how they have been building check-in, check-out relationships. We can also use check-in, check-out to teach really specific skills. One of the reasons that I love this intervention is that because it focuses our time on teaching students what we would want to be seeing instead. So rather just telling them that they're not meeting the goal because of X, Y, or Z behavior that they're demonstrating, it actually takes time to provide prompting, to provide reinforcement, and to provide specific skill instruction for those behaviors that we want to see the students doing, right? So this might look like giving them prompts or praise for work completion, on task, or engagement behaviors during class. That might look like making sure that they come off mute when it's time for discussion or that they are participating in the chat. It also can look like appropriate commenting or peer interactions. A lot of our students have been struggling with these new norms for virtual learning. This will be a great way to help teach those new behaviors that we want to see and reinforce them as well. And then finally, overall, like I said, check in, check out can really help to improve outcomes for students. The decrease in office discipline referrals or removals from virtual classrooms can lead to more time spent engaged with their class and their peer community. The reduction in classroom disruptions for behavior means that teachers are able to get through a lot more content and have a lot more time learning with students. And so we see an increase in work completion and improved academic outcomes as well. Finally, the increased opportunities for the behavior practice and the behavior feedback means that we are communicating more often, not only with the student, but also with their family. And that can really improve and strengthen relationships and connections between the home and school environments. So if you have put this into place, or if you are starting to right now, can you do this when you go back in person? The answer is absolutely. We just want to make sure that we transition the system to mirror what we were doing in one setting compared to the other. So one of the big things that we want to keep in mind here is that we want to keep mentors consistent when possible. I know that roles change, especially now from being virtual as well as going back to in person. But because we've already put in a lot of that groundwork for building that relationship, we want to make sure that we are trying to strengthen that relationship and not start from scratch when we go back in person. We also want to make sure that we are spending extra time once we do go back in person, getting to know our students and making sure that they are receiving that positive attention with their mentor throughout the day. We also want to make sure that we are setting aside time to explicitly review and reteach behaviors for in-person learning. These are going to look a lot different than virtual learning, especially given new safety guidelines or health and wellness guidelines like mask wearing. We want to make sure that during that time with the mentor at both the check-in and the checkout, we're setting aside a couple of minutes to review exactly what those safe behaviors look like in person. And then finally, the best thing about check-in, check-out is that we can fade it out over time once a student is successful. Likely, as you transition from virtual to in person, you will need to increase the intensity, most likely at the very beginning. So for example, if you were meeting with a student maybe 2 to 3 times a week, you might want to meet with them every day when we first go back in person, just so you have enough time to teach those expectations. But then based on how successful they are, as you see with their point goal data, you can fade it back out again to only a couple times a week, or you can increase the goal criteria that they're trying to meet, or you can either change the reinforcement schedule. So if the student is currently receiving a reinforcer at the end of every day, you can slowly fade that out to be only every other day or even once a week. So again, just use data here to make your decisions and see how students are successful with their check-in, check-out program. And then ultimately, we want to make sure that we are keeping in touch with families, especially as we go back in person, because this communication and this strong relationship can only persist as long as we are still being transparent and open with families. So that is all that we have for you this morning. We'd love to hear if you have any questions. If you do, feel free to throw them in the chat. Otherwise, you can unmute and shout them out. We appreciate you being here with us this morning to learn about check-in, check-out virtually. Thanks, Kumbi. Thanks, Ashley. It was great to see you both.